So I would like to welcome Eric Racine on behalf of University of Aix-Marseille.
Thank you very much. So it's really a pleasure to be here. Thanks to the organizers. Merci de cette belle invitation. I think it's a sign of leadership of your program to actually be exposing your students and researchers, the next generation of researchers, to issues related to ethics. As you will see throughout the day, I think these are issues that you'll be confronted to now or sooner or later, basically. I hope to showcase a little bit this morning how this field has grown in the last decade or so. I had the opportunity to do postdoctoral training in neuroethics in 2004 to 2006 at the very beginning of this field. And I can testify firsthand that this has been a really interesting adventure. There have been many interesting questions. And is the sound okay? Yeah. Not loud enough?
We need a microphone. This one is not enough? No.
If I bring it up, is that better? Better? No? I'm testing the nerves of the technician. No. Is that better? Yeah, I'm rather soft-spoken, so hopefully this works. But anyhow, I think I'm really thrilled to be here. I want to maybe say bring 2 or 3 caveats right up front. So the title mentions that I'll be speaking from the perspective of philosophical pragmatism. So just to reassure you, this won't be a philosophical talk. I'll have 1 slide on pragmatism. But the idea is that all of my work is influenced, or most of my work is influenced by this school of thinking, which I can't really talk about too much, but is really a meta perspective on the whole business of ethics. And then second, of course, I'm speaking from a North American perspective with some limited understanding of what's happening in Europe in terms of the debates I'll be exposing you to. And I'm not saying that this is the way to go. It probably is not the way to go in some respect. So I hope we'll have a good chance for discussion this morning and this afternoon. So I'll just warm ourselves up to the topic. So you heard the expression neuro everything this morning. And this was a nice figure, I think it's a nice figure, created by one of my previous grad students to capture the idea of a neuro world. Increasingly, we're hearing about neuroethics, neurotheology, neuroaesthetics. Many fields claim to be informed by the perspectives of neuroscience. And the promise, I think, is that this contribution of neuroscience will shape these fields and change how we view ourselves, how we view our environment, the physical environment and our interaction to the physical environment, as well as the social environment and how we interact with each other, including ethics and neuroethics. So a very big promise. And as you heard this morning, since 10, 20 years now, neuroscientists such as Martha Farah have been claiming that the question is not if neuroscience will change our future, but rather when and how, right? We have an expectation that neuroscience will have a transformative contribution on the humanities and on society. Joshua Green, who you may know from his work on the neuroscience of ethics, you may hear more about him this afternoon, has claimed that neuroscience will provide a new metaphysical mirror. For hundreds of years, even thousands of years, we have relied on philosophy to provide a meta perspective on who we are, how we think about ourselves in society, and about ourselves as individuals. Joshua Green claims that neuroscience will provide a new perspective on who we are. And basically, neuroscience will basically change or replace philosophy as this meta perspective, this critical perspective on who we are. And realizing some years before that this wave or even a tide was coming, the editors of Nature Neuroscience warn neuroscientists like you that you need to prepare for the deep and disturbing implications that neuroscience may have on society. In their context, they were worried about the impact of the neuroscience of ethics on beliefs about free will and determinism and how that would interact with religious beliefs in the US in particular. But the questions, I think, can be more international and have bearing for everyone and I think for every society. So that's the idea of this neuro world or neuroscience revolution. My focus this morning is about this idea that by using, and again that will be my sub-focus, psychopharmaceuticals or neuropharmaceuticals, we could eventually enhance brain function. So I really like this depiction from the New Yorker showing how a student using these drugs could become a super student with amazing abilities to concentrate and focus and perform. You'll hear more about this in my talk as I move on. And I'm just picking up a quote here from an article from Alan Schwartz, a science reporter from the New York Times, quoting a psychologist who says that it's really not a question of where, for example, in New York City, in which school this is happening, but rather that has become the culture. Using drugs to enhance performance has become the culture for high school students and college students. Okay. Very big claim, and I think I'll show you that things are not as black and white, or maybe not as black, if you want. But this is certainly part of the situation. And you'll see that my talk is structured around deconstructing different claims and assumptions around this debate, because I think it's partly the task of ethics, and at least a pragmatist ethics, to be scientifically informed and factually informed to see really if we have to worry so much about cognitive enhancers and about which aspects. So I've structured my lecture around 4 major topics or sections. First, I want to introduce to cognitive enhancement, and you're probably burning to hear if these drugs work or not. How prevalent is the use? Is this something widespread or not? What are the ethical issues associated with such practices? So that will be the focus of the background section. I'll try to cover this at a very high level. Second, because I'm a researcher, I'm going to present you a bit of data from the kind of work that we do in pragmatist ethics and bioethics, i.e. a lot of empirical research to try to inform our thinking with a better understanding of a context where these problems occur. And what I'm going to share with you are just small slices of results from an analysis of discourses about cognitive enhancement. And then second, a study we did on stakeholder perspectives in Montreal, the perspectives of students, parents, and healthcare providers about this very topic of cognitive enhancement. And then I want to leave enough time to wrap it up and present to you at least 4 major questions that are associated with this phenomenon and this topic, and hopefully this stages a bit the conversation to have after. So let's dive in and start thinking about cognitive enhancement and what this is about. So first question, what is cognitive enhancement? And as you can imagine, there are multiple definitions. So I picked first a definition by Eric Jungst, who actually envisioned this topic much before we started talking about cognitive enhancement or neuroenhancement. And he described it as an effort to design improvements or to produce improvements in human form or function that do not respond to legitimate medical needs. That's a very negative way of describing this phenomenon. If you think about it also, it's a pretty black and white way of describing cognitive enhancement because there are many applications that started as a response to a legitimate medical need that then became enhancement or have the possibility of becoming enhancement. The drugs I'll be talking to you about this morning respond to legitimate medical needs, I think we'll agree, but the gray zone is in where the diagnoses start and stop, and where the lifestyle uses start also. So I think It's an interesting but maybe problematic definition. Another definition is provided by Sandberg and Bostrom, and they're more or less advocates for enhancement. So they are in favor, and their definition is more optimistic or positive. They state cognitive enhancement as being an amplification or extension of core capacities of the mind through improvement or augmentation of internal or external information processing systems. So more motivation, more concentration, more memory. These are the kinds of things they allude to. However, again, this definition is interesting because it's basically alluding to the existing capacities of the mind. But what if we could design technologies that could create new capacities? And maybe Jens will talk more about this. No, maybe. But I've seen, for example, an experiment where rodents, I can't remember if it was rats or mice, were implanted with stimulation devices, allowing them to perceive infrared light, for example. So you have a monitor or a sensor that detects infrared light, projects to the visual cortex, and eventually the visual cortex rearranges to create connections with those electrodes. So that's pretty fantastic, but also potentially, raising new kinds of ethical worries. Finally, I like the description by Wayne Hall, or definition by Wayne Hall, who that really fits my topic to some extent. He says, for example, that this is the use of drugs and other interventions to modify brain processes with the aim of enhancing memory, mood, attention, people who are not impaired by illness or disorder. Healthy individuals using drugs to enhance memory and so on. And that's really my own focus this morning. So this is just a preview for Professor Clausen's talk, but just to say that there are many ways one could enhance cognitive function. Medical devices is one strategy. There are upcoming trends in research and even in uses of transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS, and transcranial direct current stimulation, or TDCS, to enhance cognitive function. I'm not going to talk about these applications, but they're out there, and it could be the new wave of cognitive enhancers. In our own group, we did a survey of the academic and print media trends on TDCS a couple of months or years ago, and we saw an increasing amount of academic published papers on TDCS. And if you look at, I'm sorry, it's hard to see even up front, not only in the back, but even up front. The blue slice of the graph here are the enhancement applications of TDCS. And you're seeing, rather growing interest in enhancement with TDCS. And interestingly, if you compare this academic publication trend to the print media coverage, you see that enhancement is one of the most discussed topics and claims more territory than the actual science. So it's interesting. The public eye is quite interested in how TDCS could be used for enhancement, whereas in research, it's a more modest area of activity. So again, it's interesting to think about in terms of when you do research on these topics, you can be pretty sure that these are going to raise attention, they're going to raise ethical and societal discussion. So probably the same could be said of stem cells, for example. But as I mentioned, I'm going to focus on neuropharmacology. That's where I've done research with my group, and I have a bit more knowledge. One of the important questions is how prevalent is this practice? Because as you saw in the opening, Schwartz will cite people that claim that this is a widespread trend. And if it's a widespread trend, we have a certain kind of ethical problem. If it's more marginal, we have another kind of issue to deal with, I think. Now, we did a review of studies that were published a little while ago on prevalence rate for the use of prescription stimulants like Ritalin or methylphenidate And most studies published talk about all kinds of recreational uses. So it could be using methylphenidate for partying, for example. That's not really enhancement, at least not according to the definitions that we have. But if you look at the uses for cognitive enhancement, the rates are much lower than for global recreational uses. So they range from something to 4% to around 11% in these studies. But the important point I think to remember is that we don't have such good prevalence data. We don't really know what the situation is. Okay? So I think it's important to be careful about what we say in terms of the prevalence rate for these practices. Okay? There are figures that could be higher or lower, but bottom line is I think the evidence is a bit shaky. Okay? That being said, interestingly, Nature published the results of a poll some years ago that really basically was a milestone in the debate about cognitive enhancement. And in 2008, they did a survey that probably I could never publish in Nature because it had a bunch of methodological problems. But they did an open survey without much control. 1,400 people responded, and about 1 out of 5, 20% of respondents, reported using drugs for cognitive enhancement uses. Okay? And you can see peaks in the younger generation and in the older segment. Interesting, but again, very poorly controlled survey, but basically set the stage to say that this is an important issue and we need to address it. But again, I'd say this is something to be taken with a grain of salt or two. In the same survey, you could see that methylphenidate was the most often used drug, so Ritalin, most often to improve concentration. 2/3 of respondents said they knew colleagues who had used the drug for cognitive enhancement. Okay? And the reported effects were rather strong. So, 1/3 saying that out of 1 to 5, the effect was rather large. But that could be placebo effects, right? We know placebos have an effect. How do we know that this is a genuine effect on their performance? But anyhow, I'd say unfortunately, this survey was used to stage a discussion in Nature. I'll come back to it because I'll talk about the paper that was published subsequently, and because it provides a nice structure to understand the ethics of this practice. Does it work? Maybe you're interested, as a first person, maybe third person, to know what society is doing and if it's really working. Again, I'd say I'm not an expert in this area for sure, but I'm not sure the evidence is there. There are many candidate drugs that are claimed to be cognitive enhancers, drugs such as donepezil, usually used to treat Alzheimer's disease, modafinil, used to treat narcolepsy, and of course stimulants like methylphenidate. So many drugs. However, it seems like that when you look at the evidence, as in particular systematic reviews done on the evidence, there's not that much supporting these uses for cognitive enhancement. Methylphenidate could improve baseline performance. Maybe if you're a non-diagnosed person with ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, perhaps that could help you. But if you're already, kind of the high-performing level, it may not be so useful. Modafinil could be increasing alertness, but perhaps only in sleep-deprived individuals, so those who already lack sleep. So it's not that surprising in a sense, but it would explain why some data some years ago, published in JAMA, reported that 90% of prescriptions for modafinil were for lifestyle uses to counteract the effects of jet lag, for example. Okay. Donepezil does not seem to be a good cognitive enhancer, and SSRIs also. So maybe not so much evidence. I think it's important. Zach Lynch, a neuroscience researcher, said, for example, that there's little reason to think that these drugs will, in any sense, constitute smart pills. And Martha Farah published a nice review paper in Nature at the end of last year where she reviewed the evidence again and she came to a similar conclusion. That being said, and that's the social scientist and ethicist, part of me speaking, it doesn't mean that it doesn't work, that people won't be using them. So the neuroscience part of you is probably saying, well, yeah, the point is moot. It's not effective. Well, that people could do non-effective things or try non-effective products, based on their beliefs and expectations. And that's why we were interested in public discourse about these drugs. Because even though the evidence is not there, there are a bunch of academics out there that are saying that they work, right? This is just, I'll spare you the details, but this is a really nice systematic review that came to this conclusion of no effects of methylphenidate on cognitive function, really, on enhancement of cognitive capacities. However, some effects of modafinil, and suggesting here the need to get involved into the ethics of discussing questions related to equity and the social aspects of modafinil use. And importantly, for a slice of my talk, is to understand this practice in the context of a demand for a drug like this one in the backdrop of a growing pressure of people in modern society to live and work disregarding their biological rhythm. So to work more, to work at different times, and so on. So the dimension of social pressures and social expectations is something you may not think of pragmatism as this kind of school of thinking, but really pragmatism was a school of philosophy that insisted that philosophy be more social. So all that we're learning about social neuroscience these days, that we're all informed by our environments, all the insights from epigenetics, that was incorporated in Dewey's thinking in a large part, but that's often disregarded because we think of pragmatism as a practical school of thinking. It was interested in practical aspect, but Dewey was trying to apply Darwin's thinking about selection and evolution in the social domain. So I can talk about this some more after if you want, but it's not related to the talk, so I have to shut up and stop talking about Dewey and pragmatism. It keeps popping up in my mind. Voila. Another important issue is cognitive enhancement unavoidable? And this is something that comes up often, that this is an inescapable trend, that no matter what we do, we'll have cognitive enhancers, we'll face a situation sooner or later. Now, of course, if you think about the history of humankind, we've been using psychoactive drugs to enhance different things, maybe not cognition, but maybe our imagination or our social interactions for a very long time. Almost all societies, as far as I know, have used products, whether it's alcohol, tobacco, marijuana, cocaine, opium, to change their cognitive functions. Maybe not with the express goal of cognitive enhancement in the way that we think about it these days. And in my eye, that's partly the problem. I don't mind so much people having a drink, but if they start thinking, well, gosh, I need to do this because society needs me to, then I think we have another kind of issue. However, it's interesting to look at what people are saying. There's a very strong current in bioethics discourse that this is an unavoidable, inescapable trend. Buchanan says, for example, it's just too late to just say no to biomedical enhancements. They're already here and more are on the way. It's true in a sense, right? TDCS, TMS, and who knows what's coming up next. But I'm not sure that the trend is so clear. Greeley and I'll publish this paper in Nature that I'll talk to you more about following the survey sponsored by Nature. And basically, in their view, cognitive enhancement should be normalized to fit the same general category as education, good health habits, and information technology. So there's nothing special about cognitive enhancement with the use of drugs. It's just another means to a similar end. And that's something I'd like to discuss with you. Is it the case? Do the means count, or only the ends, or do both count? Right? Is it only that is the problem that what really fires us up in terms of the ethics? Is it really because it's cognitive enhancement? Is it because it's about drugs? Or is it about the fact that it's cognitive enhancement with drugs that are usually prescribed? So it's kind of hard to tease these things apart. But clearly they're taking a stance here saying that the phenomenon should be normalized and we shouldn't be fussing over this practice. Marta Ferra and colleagues wrote that the question is not whether we need policies to govern neuroscientific enhancement, but rather what kind of policies we need. So again, the idea that this is an inescapable, unavoidable phenomenon has quite a bit of advocates in the literature. Now, another important question is, what are the key ethical social issues? I think you probably have already come to think about them as I'm introducing you to the topic. If you're ever interested in learning more, there have been many governmental reports and commissions on this topic. Beyond Therapy, the President's Committee on Bioethics in the US published a report. The British Medical Association published a discussion report. I was involved in a report for the government of Quebec on this phenomenon a little while ago. The American Academy of Neurology published guidance, to which I will come back to in the discussion. It's very interesting piece of guidance. And this commentary in Nature was also another important landmark. Now, if we look in detail at this commentary, I think some of the issues are spelled out. Fairness and justice, ensuring that eventually everyone that wants would have access, and that access would be equitable and fair. The safety is the first one that I skipped over, but really, if the products are not safe, then we're in, potentially another kind of situation. Making sure that those who embark on cognitive enhancement do it freely and without coercion. That's another important issue. Respect for autonomy, as we saw in the introduction. Making sure that practices are based on evidence. Right? At this point, I'm not sure we do have research-based evidence for these practices, but, and I'm not sure that, maybe a bit pessimistic, I'm not sure that knowing more about the evidence will necessarily be the trump card that changes the terms of the debate. Public understanding is a topic I'll come back to. Is the public informed of the true risks and effects of cognitive enhancement? Are the decisions made based on such evidence by public agencies and so on? Ensuring there's some kind of legal framework or regulatory framework to govern the claims that people are making on behalf of their products is another important issue. As people start marketing TDCS for cognitive enhancement, what will prevent them from doing that? I know in my country, this could be a bit complex, and Jennifer could correct me, but devices are usually, you have regulatory approval for devices when health claims are being made, right? If you want to treat or diagnose a disease, you will be seeking approval from Health Canada as our major health agency that regulates these kinds of claims. But if it's not a medical device and you're not claiming you're going to treat ADHD, but you're going to enhance mood or memory, does that really fit the terms of regulation for an agency like Health Canada? Okay? And does the thinking that we have for such products map onto devices for cognitive enhancement? And finally, the commentary stresses the role of engaging professional societies. So societies you may belong to, like Society for Neuroscience or the International Brain Research Organization, these kinds of societies, are they engaged in these debates? What are they doing to prepare society as bodies that represent, neuroscience as a field of evidence and research? What are they doing to represent evidence in these debates? Okay, so you may, maybe these are not pure ethical issues. You'll say I'm not really good at being a purist. I was born in the area of interdisciplinary scholarship, so it may not be so obvious why these are ethical issues, but the idea is to make a use eventually ethical. These would be some potential parameters or standards. You would want things to be efficacious, to be free, to be based on evidence, and so on. Okay, so it's kind of a broader lens on the ethics. Now, it's important to step back a little bit and try to think about the different stances adopted towards this issue. And in North America, we like dichotomy, and the stances are usually polarized or are divided between more liberal views and more conservative views. Basically, you'll understand quickly those in favor and those against. But you'll see the rationale behind their thinking is quite different. And I'll get back to that in the discussion, because I think we have basically a dialogue that is not, well, we don't have a dialogue, a dialogue de sourds. Basically, people are not really engaging in a genuine dialogue about the fundamental issues, about the terms of the debate and the foundations that should be guiding decisions. So a liberal perspective is provided by Art Caplan. I love this statement because it really captures the gist of the liberal perspective. If you're not harming others and you're doing this by choice, then really it's ethical. The liberal perspective is grounded in respect for autonomy, individual rights, and freedom. So as long as you're not impeding the freedom of others, you should be free to pursue enhancement. Caplan will argue that, is there anything wrong about enhancement other than potentially the risks you expose yourself to? Is there anything wrong? All those worries about justice, about cheating, about being inauthentic in your performance, he's going to say, well, those are not really substantive issues. That's quite contrary to a more conservative perspective. I know conservative doesn't sound really attractive, but I think it does capture an important set of issues. The scholars writing under this banner, if you want, you have a statement from Eric Cohen, who was an advisor to the Republican Party. I know that's not really good, again, to say, but basically, will stress an important concern. He's saying at stake is the very meaning and nature of human excellence. Okay? These kinds of practices are putting into question how we view human achievement, human excellence, and why we are proud of doing what we do. And I think these are important concerns. The problem, I think, for the conservative perspective, it's all wrapped up in often religious or traditional discourse. But I think the questions they bring forth are important. The answers may be less convincing. That will be my perspective I'll talk to you about in the last part of the discussion. Just drilling down a little bit to understand those two positions. The liberal position is often based on this idea that we have even a duty to morally enhance. Buchanan, who I'm citing again, is saying that the human history, or at least the history of human progress, is in great part the story of enhancement. If we leave things to nature, we're on for a really tough ride. Right? It's not going to be so nice. That's in contrast to the conservatives, who are sometimes saying that we shouldn't be engaging in cognitive enhancement because it's against human nature. Right? We'll often hear this argument that it's not natural. Well, what does it mean to not be natural? And Buchanan has a good point that going against forces of nature and is partly the story of human civilization. So what do we do about this argument? And of course, buried in there is a very big argument, right? That all human achievement is some kind of cognitive enhancement. I'm not sure we need to buy that argument, but it's one that's being made. conservatives will be worried sometimes about this kind of flawed quest for perfection. Michael Sandel writes on this. He says that we're lured, that we have false expectations if we think we can reach human perfection. And he criticizes that goal. Whereas John Harris provides an interesting argument for the liberal perspective. The liberal perspective is often criticized because it will create positional disadvantages, right? It's going to change the fact that the ones who enhance will kind of raise their performance above those who don't, right? And some people are even claiming that we should buy into this rhetoric. You have Julian Savulescu from Oxford saying, for example, that if everyone enhances, we'll raise the gross domestic product of Great Britain, for example. So that would be one of his arguments. We raise the positional advantage of a country with respect to others. But John Harris has another point. It's not about being better than others. It's making sure that you're improving your own life. Now, I'm not sure that cognitive enhancements do that. Perhaps they do that. But his argument is, I think, a little bit more sophisticated. It's not about being better than others. It's about being more who you want to be, yourself. Okay? So they're different. As you can see, these are very broad banners, but they're different kinds of ethical thinking that support the different stances. Okay? And of course, this is only an overview. So this will be my final section for the background, but you may wonder what's wrong with the terms of the debate at this point. And I'll explain what I think is one of the major problems in my eyes, and that is skewing a little bit the discussion. I think in those debates, we are focused on the substances. We're focused on the effects of the pills. We're focused on the risks. We're focused on the risk that potentially people are not informed about the risks. We're really, have a kind of micro view or a narrow view on the phenomenon. And interestingly, and I'll play a little bit with this aspect of the terminology, substance is constructed from the Greek, which would mean what stands under. It's basically referring to the essence. What is the essence of that phenomenon? What is the essence? What is the true nature of the phenomenon of cognitive enhancement? And as someone influenced by pragmatism, I'm interested in the circumstances. Circumstances, again, from the Greek would mean what stands around. What are the motivations leading to the use of that substance? What are the social implications of using those substances? So I think we have a bit of a blind spot in the literature. And just again, clin d'œil to Dewey, he always alluded to what he described the philosophical fallacy to criticize mainstream philosophy. I think it would be much less the case nowadays, especially in bioethics, how it has transformed philosophy, at least in North America. But he always said that the most pervasive fallacy of philosophical thinking was to take things out of context or neglect context, that we could seek what could be the pure good, the pure right, without thinking about actual context of where this would happen and thinking the complexity of real-world phenomena. And that's really where I want us to jump next in the next section of my slide, my presentation. And basically what I'm going to try to show you is I think there's a blind spot in both the conservative and the liberal views because they stress a lot individual autonomy and they share this belief that either you can say yes, either you can say no, but you have this fundamental right or ability to choose. And what I'm going to stress a little bit is I think they tend to neglect the circumstances where this kind of decision would be made. Okay? And I think it's important to attend. And that's the idea of presenting to you quickly a few slices of data to show you results from research we've done. I'll try to go quicker on this to make sure we get to the discussion section. This is just an acknowledgement to people who were involved in the work. Basically, we did an analysis of different discourses to try to understand the public psyche, if you want, around cognitive enhancement. And what we encountered are basically three paradigms, or three ways of thinking about cognitive enhancers. When you look at the bioethics literature, it's often described as a cognitive enhancement. And interestingly, enhancement comes from French, Old French, at the time when basically French offered about 20,000 words to the English vocabulary, and one of them being enhancer, which we would translate now maybe as rehausser. It means to enhance, to bring up, to raise, or from the Latin in altus, to bring higher. This terminology is quite loaded because it's already suggesting that to some extent this works. And I think the bioethicists have been tricked into propelling that language. A bit like we know, for example, in stem cell therapy, probably we shouldn't be talking too often about therapy, but maybe nuclear transfer or descriptive language that doesn't reflect the potential benefits that we don't necessarily have yet. So we got caught up in this terminology, sorry. Interestingly, the print media coverage also used similar terminology, described cognitive enhancers as a kind of lifestyle choice. However, in public health literature, you see a much more negative or critical standpoint. There, people refer to this phenomenon as illicit drug use, drug abuse, drug misuse. So it showed to us how far apart were different discourses, in particular the critical public health discourse and a rather optimistic bioethics discourse. Okay? So just to show another slide, I'm going to spare you the methodological details in this lecture about these results, but if you want in the discussion, I can get to this. But this is all terms that were used to describe methylphenidate use as a cognitive enhancer in print media. Again, this speaks to the public understanding or misunderstanding of cognitive enhancers, I think. I'm going to skip this slide, which is a bit complex, and I'm going to move on, just in, to make sure we have enough time for the discussion. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about another study we did where we tried to understand stakeholder perspectives on this phenomenon. And I'm going to rapidly describe the general results or observation. I'll come back to this issue of autonomy and context in a little while. So these were focus groups with parents, students, university students, and healthcare professionals. And basically, we found that they had wide-ranging reactions. Some were surprised, some were not surprised. Discussions tended to focus on risks, really, and not so much the benefits. You'll know that that's the third point. Often there are analogies being made that this is just like drinking coffee, this is like education. Well, when you research the understanding of these common analogies, you see they don't really percolate to anything specific. They bring up all kinds of contradictory understandings. There was, debate even in the lay population about certain ethical social issues. There was ambivalence on both the terminology of cognitive enhancement. People didn't know exactly what it meant, what it referred to. And there was also, so that's the descriptive ambivalence, but there was also normative ambivalence in that most people didn't really know what to think about it in terms of, is it good or not? Interestingly, the fact that these are prescription drugs conveyed a sense of safety. For example, if it's prescribed, it's a medication prescribed to children, then the risk must be low. Otherwise, we wouldn't prescribe them, right? So this kind of thinking, which could be semi-accurate to some extent, shows how people understand things, in the lay population. So just this is a glimpse at the major observations. I'll skip this slide to focus on the topic of choice. And basically, it was a bit of a surprise that in all three groups, the parents, the healthcare providers, and the students, there was a focus or an understanding that this was a matter of personal choice, that it really boiled down, to some extent, to individual decision making. So people really wanted to maintain this belief that it is about autonomous choices. In the end, people have to decide for themselves. At the same time, and this was paradoxical, most everyone thought that the phenomenon was due to enormous social pressures to perform and succeed in very competitive environments. Very interesting. There's, on the one hand, a commitment to believing that this is an individual choice. On the other hand, feeling that that choice is actually constrained by social pressures. It captures this idea here, really, that there's a kind of lip service to autonomy. There are social pressures pushing people to accept cognitive enhancement. And you have these reports from a student saying we're getting such a highly competitive level that you can be replaced at the snap of a finger. Therefore, that's why people are using cognitive enhancers. And you have healthcare providers saying that, for example, talking about the current situation, it's a couple of years ago, but I think it's fairly actual that we have many people going to university, but not enough jobs for these educated people. So that's creating an interest for enhancers. And I think that's an issue that's not so well captured in frameworks that try to boil it down to being about or against autonomy, such as a liberal framework, who those have a kind of a pretty, I would say, idealistic framework about excellence, such as the conservative standpoint. And I think that those are a bit disconnected from the actual expectations and the actual beliefs of people who engage in cognitive enhancement. So you saw I skipped a number of slides because I want to make sure we have a bit of time for the discussion. But in the end, those results have been published. You would have seen, if I would have spent more time on that big figure, that the views on personal autonomy varied a little bit. Parents had a more paternalistic understanding of autonomy. University students should do what they have been educated to do by their parents. Students had a more libertarian understanding of autonomy, that as long their criterion was as long as you're authentic and true to yourself, then it's ethical. And healthcare providers had a more kind of a informed autonomy model that as long as people understand the risks and their impact on their health. So, of course, there are many limitations to this kind of data, but at least in my eyes, some data is better than no data. And even though there are limitations, it helps to get us thinking a little bit beyond our own essences, right? Our own imagination of what are the ethical issues to engage in this kind of research. So what I wanted to do to kind of set up the discussion is bring back, based on the background I laid out and the results I shared, 3 or 4 major questions to address in the future. I mean, there could be others, but at least I wanted us to have a couple in our back pocket. One of them is what could be done about the expectations and misunderstandings about safety and efficacy. I think you saw data in the public discourse suggesting that. I think you see claims in the mouth of bioethicists that don't really speak facts, speak more about hopes. Interestingly, if you look, this is the example of TDCS. I'm again borrowing a little bit on Professor Clausen's topic, but just to make the point that if you look at discussions in the print media and you break it up in the different tones, optimistic being blue, and green critical, and red the balance, or in between. It's very hard to see, but the point is, when you look at print media coverage talking about enhancement, it's highly optimistic. See the pie chart. It's really highly optimistic. So there's an appetite out there for these enhancers, right? They almost exist before they exist. They exist in our minds before they exist in scientific and social reality to some extent. And these are just a sample of headlines from the print media reporting how enhancement uses are captured. I think you get it very quickly. Lots of enthusiasm. Now, what are we going to do about this? One model could be to have a more informed public sphere and act upon journalists. And an example I wanted to cite is the Australian Press Council, who has guidelines for reporting about drugs and drugs of addiction. Well, it's another category, but it's an interesting analogy or model to keep in mind. And in there, they suggest, for example, that reporters should not glamorize the use of illicit drugs. They should not talk about the details of how people get those drugs or use them. Shouldn't be reporting how you inject heroin and how you feel after. All these, kind of glamorous aspects of using drugs should not be reported. Now, here we have an example of something where we have much greater social consensus about the negative aspects, right? Drug addiction, really bad condition, hard drugs. We don't really have that for cognitive enhancement. We don't really know how to categorize the phenomenon. Is it abuse, enhancement, a lifestyle choice? So another path, I think, is suggested by a statement by Alan Leshner, who you may know. He said, and this is stepping back in the history of neuroethics, and brings us back to the initial beginning of the day, that the unique attributes of the brain as an organ system and its centrality to our concept of our own humanity raise an array of ethical issues that must be resolved in open dialogue, involving both the scientific community and the wider public. So that's another approach. We've captured this idea in a multi-directional model of science communication some years ago. The idea here was to recognize, and again, I want to plug Dewey and pragmatism every time I have a chance to, but Dewey modeled his thinking about ethics on the model of experimental science. And one way to think about ethics is that it shares with science this commitment to inquiry and debate, right? And I didn't go into the details, but we do ethics when our common morality doesn't suffice to respond to ethical dilemmas and challenges, right? 90% or more of the time, we resolve ethical issues just by the fact that we have a moral common sense. But when that common sense doesn't suffice, ethics comes in to support decision-making and sort things out. And cognitive enhancement, I think, is one situation where we don't have clear answers. So the idea is to stress that this inquiry and debate are central to both science and ethics. We share that commitment, at least secular ethics and ethics as developed, I think, by the Greeks. And that to really have an enriched discussion, we need to engage different stakeholders. That's the idea. That's the model. And there are different attempts to implement such models, whether it's through teaching and talking in interdisciplinary fora like this morning, or through more elaborated forms of public discourse. Second important question. Coercion and circumstances seem to shape the phenomenon, if you believe some of our results about cognitive enhancement, but are ethical approaches sensitive to this aspect of the debate? I would say that sometimes they don't. And a good example is this piece of guidance published by the American Academy of Neurologists. I was very surprised to read this guidance, to be honest, but it's an esteemed professional society, probably the leading clinical neurology association in the world. And it said basically as advice to its neurologists who respond to requests for adult patients requesting enhancers, that the prescription of medications for neuroenhancement is not ethically obligatory, it's not ethically prohibited, and therefore is ethically permissible. So even I heard reactions, but even in Canada, we tend to view things a little bit differently because of our public healthcare system. We're worried about the resources that would be used by neurologists who follow and screen patients who have no reported illness or disorder. And that was one of the pillars of the Quebec governmental committees, that, hey, we barely have enough resources to follow people who have genuine severe brain injury or cerebral palsy or whatever. Are we going to spend our precious resources on these kinds of uses? But the US is very singular in its structure in terms of public healthcare, of healthcare systems. There's a huge part for the private sector, and it may explain why there's a kind of business model that is recommended for practitioners. Cynthia Follini and I, a former PhD student now in Australia, wrote back to the American Academy of Neurology saying, hey, wait a minute, do you think that clinicians will be able to sort out the societal pressures that individual patients face? Are you sure that you want to really dismiss those kinds of concerns, or are you sure you're integrating those kinds of concerns in your perspective? And they responded that basically those kinds of pressures about context would be addressed in the physician-patient relationship. They thought that was the best way. I don't necessarily agree. We can talk about this. I don't agree, I think, because of where I come from philosophically, but interestingly, we gathered data. That was a large survey, online survey that we did a little while ago. And I can't explain all the details, but basically we created a survey where we varied the profile of the substance, its effects, and the probability of side effects, and we varied social contextual factors such as how peer prevalence was reported. So every respondent had a situation where we would report, imagine that there's cognitive enhancement drugs in use. Let's say 50% of people use them. How do you think about the moral acceptability of such a practice? And it's interesting to see that the contextual effects or factors have more or less similar effects to the characteristics of the substance. So thinking about the social context is important, even though the effects are rather small. But one of the most significant effects was when we prompted the respondents to think about situations where there was no effective policy, a policy but is not sanctioned. We're just saying, hey, Aix-Marseille has a policy against cognitive enhancement. No details about it. Just that diminished the moral acceptability. And adding a sanction didn't really change much. But it's saying that if a society thinks that this is wrong, then saying something about it could have an effect. And maybe we shouldn't be so dismissive. We often think, this is just words, this is just policy, it's not. Well, it sends a message, and maybe that message can be somewhat effective. Are professional societies ready to support their membership to think about these issues? A while ago, I really liked this slide because it was talking about the difficulty that physicians have discussing substance abuse with patients. And you can see here that prescription drug abuse was even more difficult and less often talked about by physicians. These are older data. Maybe the situation has changed now that there's a pandemic of drug abuse, especially in northeastern America, and there's also quite a bit of prescription drug abuse. But anyhow, in our report for the Quebec government, we stress the need to prepare medical professionals, to expose them to this issue of drug abuse and use for cognitive enhancement, which you could fold into drug misuse, depending on your paradigm, where you fit in. I tend to view this as drug misuse. So I think we should be educating clinicians to be able to talk to patients about this matter. However, government didn't follow our advice. Isn't that strange? I'm just joking. And maybe another final question is, ultimately, is there anything beyond risks? Is there anything, as Art Kaplan challenges us, to think about more than risks and individual decision making. So in thinking about this issue, I had a paper circulated. It's a chapter from my book where this, so I'm going to conclude quickly, right? So I'm only going to allude to the fact that I think, I'll just show this rapidly. There are two different ways of thinking about the ethics, at least two different ways, and I think the liberal-conservative divide is not the most useful. And what I tried to stress is that there are two ways of thinking about ethics that underlie those positions. There's one of them that views ethics as a criterion of moral acceptability. There's another view that speaks to moral praiseworthiness. I think that's a catchier way to talk about this than just a conservative stance. And the idea here is that they both allude to different kinds of questions. Moral acceptability asks if we can morally do it, whereas moral praiseworthiness asks if we should morally do it. So it doesn't mean that you can, that you should. Those are two different criteria. And one of them, I think hinges much more on not doing harm to others, your negative obligations, and one alludes or calls upon more positive duties and obligations, right? Is this something we should be doing? Does it correspond to our ideals, to what we think is morally right or best? And this paradigm, I think, alludes to more extrinsic sources of morality, if not doing harm to others. So what I call upon, which I don't have time to discuss, is to really recognize the value of both approaches. And I think if you logically break down all the possible answers to those two criterion, and I've developed two tests that I won't talk about, but basically you boil it down that the liberal perspective thinks it's morally acceptable and morally praiseworthy. We should do it, we can do it, we should do it. The moral conservatives think we don't. As I believe, I think consistent with a more moderate liberal view is, I'm not sure we fulfill all the requirements of the moral acceptability test that I can't speak about too much, but basically we don't have good evidence, we don't have good preparation of clinicians and so on. So there are many things that I think would need to be in place to respect even the basic standards of a liberal approach, if it's taken seriously. But moreover, we haven't had the kind of open dialogue that I mentioned to really respond to those questions or deeper questions about moral praiseworthiness. So just quickly to wrap it up, I think there are many assumptions in the debate about cognitive enhancement. I think my whole talk was about trying to deconstruct different assumptions. Hopefully that was helpful in thinking about this debate. And I stressed that the circumstances of the debate have not been well addressed in my eyes. I think this is a message maybe of more greater relevance for you, that there's room for more engagement of professional societies, including those that involve basic neuroscientists as well as clinical neuroscientists. And we need to engage in creative, deliberative thinking. So we need to think about how we can come up with ethical positions that pay due respect to the fact that we live in Western democracies with strong commitments to individual rights and autonomy, but at the same time, our societies are built on other kinds of ideals also. But I think, contrary to the conservatives, looking back in tradition is not really the way to go. And acknowledging that different societies could look at this differently, I think is important. I want to thank members of my unit and sponsors of this work. And I'm going to flash back the discussion questions in case you want them. Voilà.
Thank you very much for the interesting talk. So we have time for one or two questions. Thank you.
Just one information regarding the involvement of basic science societies on these issues. There is every year now at Society for Neuroscience meeting in the US, a social organized on neuroethics in which Barbara Sahakian is very much involved. So it's something they have developed in the UK. We are a bit late in France, as you see. It's one of the first initiatives to do that in the training. But in England, they've started to write textbooks for the students and to raise all these issues. One point I wanted to raise, but we won't have time to discuss it. But one thing I find difficult in your talk is that you have a big statement on the fact that cognitive enhancers don't work. But pharmacologically speaking, they're psychostimulants because they mimic amphetamine and they have similarities with cocaine. So the parallel with drug addiction is very interesting indeed because some of the cocaine addicts take Ritalin actually. So it's really, then the debate is really different if you consider that it has some effects, and then how can we morally discuss that in the perspective of maybe mimic the drug addiction discussions, and possibly also taking into account it's not only free will to take it, but there are some traits in personalities that will be more tempted to go into that, and they can't do much because it's kind of a disease. So if you look at it with this perspective, then the debate can be totally different.
It can, absolutely. Yeah, I think you're right to pay tribute to the social issues roundtable. This has been in place, I think, since the early 1970s. So it's been a strong commitment of the SFN to discussing ethics and animal rights. Regarding the point that I made, I think I was maybe not careful enough. I reported studies that say that these drugs don't have effects as cognitive enhancers. But they do have effects, of course, for clinical treatments, and they do have a profile that makes them very susceptible to drug abuse. And that is why, for example, in Canada and the US, methylphenidate is a scheduled substance, and you can't possess it without a prescription, otherwise it becomes a legal issue. So because of the risk of addiction and abuse. So you're very right. And in this case, that maybe I didn't pay enough attention to this, but it's a really important concern for this drug. Its molecular structure suggests that it could, be liable to addiction. So I'm often very surprised. I'm making the fallacy myself by speaking this morning, but in bioethics, we often don't pay enough attention to these issues. We start equating enhancers or psychoactive drugs to enhancers and coffee and whatever without looking at the drug profile. So I think you have a very good point. In this case, there's a risk for health, and it's not been well addressed.
Perhaps it would be prudent to also draw a parallel between this cognitive enhancement and sports enhancement. I mean, that's been around for a couple of decades now, and the motivation behind sports enhancing drugs in performing athletes could probably be addressed as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I made that analogy. I know it's often made in the literature, but two interesting points. When you look at the guidance of the American Academy of Neurology, I think it stands out in contrast to what sports medicine would suggest. I think they're much more against enhancers than the American Academy of Neurology, suggesting there's a discrepancy in the response. It's okay for cognitive enhancement. It's not okay for physical performance enhancement.
Well, it
right?
would be a question of the psychological motivation behind it, right?
Yeah, and I think another point to make about this comparison is sports enhancement could be for a very few. Cognitive enhancement could be for the many, with motivations that are different, like for work, for education, whatever. So raises the concerns, I think. What?
Thank you very much. So there will be more time for questions coming up. So we'll shift to the next speaker.
We have the afternoon session. We have half an hour or so.